Well, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to our little study today. Just to let you know that next week we will not be having class because it's the 4th of July week, and so I'll give you a little break, but look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks from today. As you can see on our screen, we got up to Judges chapter 1, and we finished with the 10th verse last week. And as we pick up in verse 11, there's some fascinating things that I would have never been able to pick up without just a little bit of knowledge of Hebrew and a wonderful website called Bible Hub that helps us just dig into the meaning of these words. Because we look at it in verse 11, I would have glossed over quickly. It talks about the inhabitants of Debir, and the name of Debir before was a word that's hard to pronounce, but it's Kirjath Sefer. And but I went to look at Bible Hub and bring it up on my screen here. And when I saw the Hebrew letters, the word Debir has the Dalet, Beit, and Resh, which is very similar to the word Devar, which is used for words from the heart or intellectual words that are spoken that mean a lot. It is also the word for things, and so it's kind of serves two different purposes. So it was interesting that this name of the city changed. And then, why was it even in here? There's obviously significance. So I looked down at the word of the name of the city that it previously was, and I find it's in Hebrew a hyphenated word called Hirat Sefer. And right away, the word Sefer comes out to me that this is the word for books in Hebrew. And the word kiryat is the word for city. So formally, this city was known as the city of books. And that became very, very interesting to me because that would lend me to think that a city of books would be an intellectual site, place of higher knowledge, greater knowledge. It's where writing took place. People were literate. You could write your thoughts. People would read your thoughts. And, today we don't think anything of it because we have books everywhere and people go to school and they learn how to read and write, and we can go to the internet, we can go to the library and have everything at our fingertips. But back in this day, it was not the same way. Literacy was very low, and people were just happy to have enough food to eat for the day, let alone, you know, sit down and read a book for a couple hours. Just didn't happen. So this tells me that this was a city where they had their basic needs taken care of, had some wealth to them so that they had time to study. Um, and again, this is before the Greek Roman era, mainly the Greek era, where philosophy and the arts and mathematics and the cultural sciences ever took off. So this was predates that, quite a while. So this was a kind of an interesting city. But what I'm trying to decipher here is, why was the name changed from a city of writing, a city of books and intellectual, to a city of Deber, which could mean that they were words from the heart, or could mean that they were uh, people of materialism, of things. And so again, we don't have an answer, but I'm just positing here that it's possible that their intellect and their knowledge took them into a very materialistic lifestyle. And so it was called the city of things, the city of materialism, the city of possessions. And just an interesting tidbit, because obviously it shows up in God's word and is there for our instruction for some reason. And, is it possible that their self-absorption of learning and of writing and of gaining all this intellect led them to be reliant upon possessions and seek after possessions? We'll move on from there. We'll leave you with that thought. So anyway, it was conquered by the Israelites. And then we come to another fascinating portion of scripture here from Judges chapter 1, verses 12, all the way to verse 15. As I started reading this, I had a little bit of deja vu saying, wait a minute, I read this before. This story sounds so familiar. And so I found out that looking back in our studies that we covered this in Joshua chapter 15, verses 16, 17, and 18. And I included it here in blue. And what's so interesting is this is almost word for word a repetition of what was covered in Joshua, even though Joshua episode took place much earlier than what we felt was recorded here in Judges. But yet the writer, which we assume was Caleb here, found it necessary to repeat this because it just meant something to him. And so the whole story is replayed and almost word for word between Judges account and Joshua account. We won't go through the story again, although it is a fascinating story about a woman here who was the daughter of Caleb. Um, and if you remember the story, she was a very dynamic young lady and really stood up for herself, made a name for herself, was very forthright in promoting herself, and this was a quite a I don't know how to word it here, but it's in this day and time, this was a unusual thing for her to take this stance because it was a time dominated by men, male chauvinism, women were suppressed, but yet here you see this little uh, glimmer of hope, this little light that shines, if you will, for women to stand up and promote themselves and to be counted like the men were. And I don't think it's any accident that it's here and here twice in the Bible. Again, we have to remember that God is not a male chauvinist. He created men and women equally. Women are created in God's image the same way that men are created in God's image. And we tend to forget that in reality, God is a spirit. And he is, even though we will ascribe to him male attributes, and we see that through this. A lot of that has to do with just the times as they existed, and that women have prominent roles in the Bible. Women have prominent roles in many wonderful places, and we'll see this in Judges. We'll see women take on roles of prophets, prophetesses, they call them, and women of renown, and they're used as strongly as the men are. And that's not always highlighted properly, and we'll try to make sure we give that its due. So this story goes on, and Caleb's story then changes and moves to verse 16. It talks about more conquests, and we see that Judah went with Simeon, slew the Canaanites. Last week we talked about why Judah and Simeon were somewhat tied together because of where they lived, with that map, of Simeon being right in the middle of the land of Judah. And so it lists their conquests. They obviously had a lot of work to do yet. But verse 19 is the one that stands out to me. Um, they were trying to obtain the Lord's favor. They obviously did not have the same battle equipment that their neighbors had. They were commanded by God not to have horses, not to have chariots, not to use all the pagan weapons of war, but they had to use more basic tools of war. And the intent was that they would trust in God and God would give them the victory. So verse 19 is a little interesting where it says the Lord was with Judah. Okay, they besought the Lord spoke to them. They drove out the inhabitants of the mountain, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, it says, because they had chariots of iron. So it's like, well, what's up with this? Why did they have favor? Why was God with Judah? But they couldn't accomplish the directive that God gave them. And why were the chariots of iron such a big deal? Well, when I look to the Bible commentators, they say that what happened here is that Judah and was falling back into idolatry. And so they put the blame on Judah, saying that, okay, they weren't wholeheartedly serving God, and God gave them a partial victory, but he also withheld victory because they weren't wholly united with the Lord, that idolatry had crept in, and this was somewhat of a punishment that they couldn't accomplish all of their mission. Okay, I will accept that. But as I'm reading this, I also notice that we have two different areas of terrain. You have the inhabitants of the mountain, and you have the inhabitants of the valley. The inhabitants of the valley would be level playing field, obviously more conducive to chariots, which are being pulled by horses, whereas the inhabitants of the mountain would require very different combat style. It would be, you couldn't have these instruments of war. It was more of a lot of cover, a lot of um, battles that would be guerrilla type, we call it today guerrilla type warfare. Of you couldn't gather in a large group because the terrain just didn't afford it. You'd be in smaller groups, and they seem to have success here fighting in more of hand-to-hand combat. And so obviously, God could have given them the victory in the valley because he has done this in the past. We'll see with the Philistines and the chariots, and later on when, David comes and fights Goliath, they're in the valley, they're not in the mountain. But we do see that there are two types of warfare here. So again, not giving us an answer, but giving us a little bit of insight into that this was two different types of warfare, but yet something had happened, that the Lord was with them when they were fighting in these smaller hand-to-hand combat, but when it came to the bigger battlefields against much stronger opponents, they weren't able to conquer them. And then we see some other things happening here. Verse 20 is really interesting, that Caleb fought against the sons of Anak. Remember last week we spoke about that these were Goliath's ancestors, and there were more than three, but they did kill three. Or does the word expel not mean kill? Let's take a look. I just thought of that now. Let's take a look at the Hebrew. Let's go to verse 20 and just see if that sheds any light on what this expel means. And so this is, really easy for me here for us to go through. You see the word translated as expel, vayores. And so we click on this little uh, part here, and it gives us the root word where it says to dispossess. So basically, it doesn't say that they killed these sons of Anak, that these giants were not killed, but they dispossessed them, that they were gone from them. And maybe that's the reason that Goliath came into the picture later, is they were not killed, and the Israelites were not doing exactly what God had wanted them to do. You see kind of a change in their battle outcomes. And so here Caleb expelled these three sons. You get to verse 21, and even gets more desperate, if you will, that the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites, but they kept them in the land and put them into servitude, which again is not what God wanted them to do. Um, but again, compromises were made, and we find that this later was detrimental to Israel. Verse 22 is interesting. We see the house of Joseph. Now, remember, there was no house of Joseph. Joseph's inheritance was divided between his two sons. One portion went to Ephraim, and the other went to Manasseh. So did they come together and support one another because they were brothers? And it's very interesting that they were called the house of Joseph here. And but it says that the Lord was with him. Of course, that's the most important thing we could realize, or that they would want, is that the Lord was with them. It says that they came to, again, really interesting word in the King James called descry. I had to look it up and found that in Hebrew it just means to spy out. So it must be a archaic term from the 1600s meant to spy out Bethel. The word Bethel is a very common word in the Bible. It's actually two words. We'll just take a look at it in the Hebrew because it's kind of fun. And so we get to the house of Bethel, and you see as my cursor is going around, it's really the word Beit, which is house, and El, which is the word for God. So Bethel, Beit El means house of God. Just a little bit of fun information here. And this was the name of the city before it was named Luz. So again, we have some very interesting changes of names. What's the purpose of it being here? Obviously, a house of God means a lot more than loose. I need to look at what that word loose means. Um, so we'll just click on this here, see if it comes up. And it doesn't really give us a good explanation. We'd have to dig a little bit deeper. It just tells us that it was a Hittite city. But again, the whole story behind why this name of the city changed, that it was called Luz, but now it's called Beth El, or House of God, um, gets into some very interesting um, story here, that they went to this city and the spies came, and here coming out of the city they saw a man, and they approached the man and they said, hey, we're did they introduce themselves? Did they say that we're Israelites and we're here to conquer you? I don't see any of that, but somehow the man knew them. They got the trust of the man and they said, show us the entrance to the city and we will show you mercy. Well, if the guy just came out of the city, obviously there were city gates there. It didn't take, you know, a lot of intelligence to know where the entrance to the city was. So they were really asking was, is there a hidden entrance? Is there a secret way to come in and get into the city without being obvious and going into the city gates? And of course, the man, verse 25, showed them this secret entrance to the city. And so there must have been something going on here. This reminds me a lot of when they went to the land of Jericho, the city of Jericho, in the book of Joshua, and they've got a went in, took lodging with Rahab, and said, "Okay, you show us mercy. We're going to protect your family." There had to be a lot going on here packed into these two verses, that this man, was he ordained by God to just come out of the city just at this time, that he wouldn't run back in and alert all the people that the Israelites were coming. He gave himself over to being compliant and going along with them. Did he know that God was going to deliver them? And was the fear of God upon everyone in this city? And so they knew they couldn't stand against Israel. And so he felt that God was giving him favor. And he obviously took them up on this, showed them the entrance. They smote the city, but this man they let go with all his family. And this man then fled into the land of the Hittites, which was quite a ways away, and built a city called, the name of the city, Luz, and it was thereof this day. So again, I'm reading a lot into this, but this is a interesting tidbit. I tend to think that this man obtained favor from God, and that his success here, or the sparing of his life, was attributed to the mercies of God upon him, and that God granted him a new life, a new being, of a new state of being in a different land, and that maybe his life was changed, and maybe he built this city, but it was more of a tribute to the mercies of God. Why he didn't stay with the Israelites and become assimilated into their life, I really don't know. But here was a man who had no reason to ever make it into the Bible. We don't know his name, but we know that he acted in accordance with God's plan and purpose. He acted in a way that helped God achieve his purpose, helped the Israelites achieve their purpose, and it looks like God rewarded him, which I find extremely comforting and extremely just a showing of God's mercy to people who like all of us, really didn't deserve it, but found mercy from God and found a new life in a different land. And so you can read a lot into it. Interesting story. And that's where we'll leave off today, with the ending on verse 26. But I pray that you've been blessed by this and encouraged. And again, that through this we see a God of mercy in the midst of where maybe others would see, all killing and destruction and a God of anger and vengeance. Here we see these little nuggets of God's grace and God's mercy coming through. So hope you enjoyed that and have yourself a wonderful week, and look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.